The story begins with Sandra, a psychiatric nurse, who after graduating starts looking for a job that suits her. This comes after she had to decline a job offer in a distant city, so she decides to look for a more appropriate position. At this time, Sandra learns from her friend Maria that there is a mental health facility in need of nurses urgently. It's a residential facility, meaning it includes housing for the patients. Maria tells her that the place is indeed close by, and Sandra decides to accept the job. She goes for the job interview the next day and learns that her shifts would be 24 hours on, followed by 48 hours off. They agree on all the details, and Sandra starts her job the following day. The facility is a small building consisting of 5 floors. The first floor is dedicated to reception, the second to various clinics and medical examinations. The third floor serves as housing for the doctors and nurses, and the fourth and fifth floors are for patient accommodation. Sandra's day passes by quietly. Everything seems very normal until she goes to her room to sleep. She turns off the lights, gets into bed, but suddenly jumps out of bed in fright. She quickly turns on the room light, running towards the switch, and turns it on. She looks around the room in panic and fear because she thought she saw someone moving in the room while she was on the bed. All she can remember about his details was that he was tall. Sandra turns off the light and goes back to bed, closes her eyes, and sees the same person in front of her. She sits up in bed, catching her breath, frightened and puzzled by what she saw, not understanding why she saw it or who it could be. At the same time, she tries to convince herself that it's all illusions, perhaps hallucinations, because she's in a new place and not used to sleeping away from home. She closes her eyes again and sees him, the same person, but this time it feels like he is sitting in front of her in the room. When she opens her eyes, there's no trace of anyone. Closing her eyes again, she sees him. But Sandra becomes more scared when she feels movement next to her in the room, and a strange smell spreads, a smell of decay. She gets up from the bed, turns on the light again, and finds nothing in the room. She leaves the light on and sits in a small chair in the room, closing her eyes cautiously because she's afraid to see him again. And indeed, her fear is justified because she sees him again. This time, however, she feels a strange sensation that his features are clearer than ever before. Bald, very tall, excessively so, with bulging eyes wide open and a strangely wide mouth, screaming a powerful scream. At that moment, Sandra opens her eyes and leaves the room to find her colleague Angelina standing in the hallway. Angelina approaches her, and they start talking about the facility. Angelina tells Sandra that she has been working at this facility for a long time, almost 9 years, and that the facility itself has been operating for a very long time. Sandra asks Angelina about the nature of the patients in this place, wondering if there are any who are dangerously ill to the point where they might harm themselves or others. Angelina assures her that currently there are none, and suggests they go upstairs for a tour to check on some of the patients and monitor their treatment. As they go up, Sandra learns that the 4th and 5th floors are designed for patient accommodation, housing a large number of rooms that might seem startling at first glance, but are typical for a psychiatric or mental health facility. They notice some security personnel, but what catches Sandra's attention is a section on the 5th floor reserved for the most dangerous patients. Curious, Sandra approaches but notices it's heavily guarded. Angelina enters one of the rooms and asks Sandra to wait outside, not to enter any room without her due to Sandra being new and not yet practiced in this field, as per the management's instructions. Taking advantage of Angelina's absence, Sandra's curiosity leads her toward the wing for the most dangerous patients. Security stops her from entering, citing the area's danger and management's orders. Sandra returns to Angelina, and after finishing their tasks, they head back to their rooms. Sandra sits in her chair, closes her eyes to re-envision the scene, and sees the same person in her room again. As she continues to close her eyes, she sees the person sitting motionlessly on a chair until he makes a terrifying movement that scares Sandra. He opens his mouth in an unnaturally wide manner, as if laughing, but the sight is very disturbing, as if his face split in two. Sandra opens her eyes to find him standing in front of her, screams in fear, and at that moment, Angelina enters the room, visibly shaken. Angelina comes closer, takes Sandra by the hand, and they leave the room. Angelina asks Sandra what happened, and Sandra tells her everything. Angelina then questions why Sandra chose that room when there were many other vacant rooms. She explains that when she first arrived at the facility, there was a patient who suffered from a peculiar condition where he wouldn't speak, only laugh in hysterical fits. He stayed in that room for a long time and eventually died there of natural causes. However, since the facility was renovated and the floor was allocated for the medical staff, especially that room, it seems that the patient appears to those who choose to stay there. After finishing her story, Angelina advises Sandra to leave the room and stay in any other room. Sandra agrees, though she is skeptical of Angelina's story, feeling that something unnatural is happening and that Angelina might be hiding part of the truth without understanding why. Sandra moves to another room and goes to sleep, experiencing no problems in the new room except for a strange dream where she finds herself in the facility's reception area. A group of soldiers enters Sandra's room, carrying one of their comrades, and they ask Sandra to help save him. As Sandra approaches the injured soldier, she recognizes him. It's the same person she saw in her room, laughing with that same laugh, which frightens her. Trying to escape, she looks at the rest of the soldiers and realizes they all share his facial features. Sandra wakes up terrified and confused. Exiting her room, she encounters a nurse colleague and asks about Angelina, but strangely, the nurse claims there's no one by that name here. Sandra, becoming anxious, insists she was with her all night and starts to describe Angelina, but the nurse denies her existence, stating there are only 4 nurses and none are named Angelina. Determined to understand what's happening, Sandra decides to visit the Employee Affairs Department. She inquires about a nurse named Angelina, describing her appearance. The employee asks when Sandra last saw her, and upon hearing it was last night, he searches through old records and shows Sandra a picture, asking if this is the Angelina she's referring to. Sandra confirms it is. The employee warns Sandra that what he's about to say may be hard to hear and advises her to brace herself. He reveals that Angelina was indeed a nurse at the facility, working there for over 5 years, known for being calm and very beautiful. One day, while Angelina was at the reception, a man with an odd appearance, very tall, bald, with wide eyes, wearing a tattered and dusty old military uniform as if he had returned from the dead or been buried alive, approached her. He introduced himself as Marion Duchesne, claiming to have died 10 years ago. Initially thinking it was a joke, Angelina asked how he returned from the dead. Marion explained he had been tormented in this place before his death and that his spirit had returned. Feeling sympathy, Angelina, considering the facility's mission to treat mental and psychological diseases, arranged for Marion to be admitted to a room upstairs. Doctors began examining Marion, but terrifyingly, nothing indicated he was mentally ill. Everything suggested he was mentally and psychologically healthy. Angelina was frightened by the confirmation of his mental stability, as it meant his story might be true, especially given his bizarre appearance upon entering the reception. Angelina, engulfed in fear and astonishment, continued her work but sought to uncover the truth about Marion. By chance, she found an old newspaper article about the disappearance of a soldier named Marion Duchesne, who, after extensive searches with no results, was declared dead. Angelina continued her search in the hospital archives among patient records, but found nothing about him. Suddenly, just as Marion had appeared out of nowhere, he vanished without a trace. Time passed until developments in the building led to the facility's current state. One day, Angelina sleeps in one of the rooms designated for medical staff. From her first day, she screams, saying she sees Marion every time she closes her eyes in the room. Angelina begins to struggle with this condition, leading to medical examinations. Then, one day, Angelina enters her room and does not come out again after hanging herself from the ceiling. To this day, no one knows the secret behind Marion's appearances or why Angelina hanged herself. The employee is frightened when Sandra mentions she saw exactly what he described. Angelina, as she said, and also Marion in the room, laughing strangely. The employee suggests there's a secret, hidden connection between Marion and the place, especially since it has been 20 years since Marion's disappearance, marking the second decade anniversary of the event. Sandra thanks the employee and decides she must leave the facility because she feels endangered. The employee mentions there's one person who might help her understand the truth about Marion, offering more details. He says the person's name is Marcus, a writer specializing in paranormal and supernatural phenomena who has previously reported on the events of Marion's disappearance and Angelina's death. Sandra contacts Marcus with the information provided by the employee and visits him. Marcus, a man with a somewhat strange appearance, with a thick beard and long hair, welcomes Sandra into his home after she introduces herself and expresses her need for help. Sandra recounts everything that happened to her, prompting Marcus to reveal that he had heard about Angelina's suicide 10 years ago, a psychiatric nurse at a health facility. Before Angelina, he had written about the disappearance of a soldier named Marion. After falling ill one day, Marion's comrades took him to the nearest hospital. Unfortunately, the hospital served as a front for terrorist activities and was run by a spy. Upon seeing Marion, the spy subjected him to severe torture to extract military secrets, breaking his jaw in the process, which explained his unnaturally wide smile. The torture continued until a fire broke out in the hospital. The hospital administration used the fire as an opportunity to report Marion's death, handing over a completely charred body to the military, making it unrecognizable. Eventually, Marion was left alone in a small room without food or water until he died, and his body was left to decay. When a staff member entered the room days later, he found that Marion's body had disappeared as if it had evaporated. Strangely, his spirit remained, especially in his room, which is why Sandra saw him. Marcus concludes that after these events were uncovered, the hospital administration was arrested and executed, but no one knows what happened to Marion's body. A year after the fire, the hospital was transformed into a psychiatric facility. 10 years after the incident, Angelina was working at the hospital when Marion appeared to her, claiming he had died 10 years ago. They admitted him to the facility, and during examinations and treatments, they were surprised that his body did not respond to any treatments, neither negatively nor positively, and Marion disappeared again after a few days. However, what's peculiar is that Angelina entered a strange state and, after a few days, ended up hanging herself in her room. Marcus believes the reason behind Angelina's death is her refusal to leave the place after discovering the truth, even though she knew she might die. He theorizes that Marion appears every 10 years, which explains why Sandra saw him today. Sandra asks if she too might die because she saw him, or what might happen to her. Marcus advises the only solution is for her to permanently stay away from the place, suggesting that the appearances of Angelina and Marion to her could be nothing more than a warning. Following this, Sandra decides not to return to the hospital again.